Mental health and incarceration, unequal burdens in the criminal justice system. California's jails and prisons are the largest mental health treatment facilities in the world, with more than one-third of inmates diagnosed with a mental disorder before incarceration. Both deinstitutionalization and harsher criminal sanctions have left the mentally ill without meaningful treatment options, leading to disproportionate representation among the incarcerated population. Incarceration, in place of mental health rehabilitation, is an inhumane treatment of the mentally ill and leads to increased exposure to criminogenic factors, creating negative impacts on the mentally ill and the surrounding community. How mental health issues can contribute to incarceration. 37% of prison inmates and 44% of jail inmates in the United States were diagnosed with a mental health disorder prior to incarceration. Compared to the roughly 1 in 5 Americans experiencing mental illness, the percentage of incarcerated people diagnosed with a mental health disorder is double that of the national percentage. Between 2002 and 2017, the number of incarcerated people diagnosed with a mental disorder in California nearly doubled, with over 45% receiving mental health care within state prisons during 2017. Despite popular opinion, the crimes for which mentally ill people are incarcerated are not always violent. From 2011 to 2012, 42% of prisoners with a mental health history were incarcerated for violent crimes, similar to the 41% incarcerated for property crimes. Given that almost half of the incarcerated population has been diagnosed with a mental health disorder or has met the threshold for SPD, many people would assume a causal relationship between mental health and crime. Although there is a correlation between people with mental illness, especially those with schizophrenia or a low IQ, and the common belief that all mentally ill people are bad people who do bad things. However, being diagnosed with a mental disorder does not mean that someone is more likely to commit crimes, especially violent ones. People with mental illness often do not have the capacity to understand and control their actions, leading them to commit crimes. This does not mean that they are bad people, but rather that they have not received proper treatment and support for their illness. Many mentally ill people first encounter the criminal justice system because of an insignificant crime, usually a misdemeanor that carries a sentence of less than a year. These crimes can include trespassing because being symptomatic creates barriers to staying housed, or shoplifting because they cannot get food otherwise. Although there may be a large portion of the incarcerated population who commit crimes out of necessity, there is an important distinction between those with mental illness and those without. Mentally ill people often commit crimes out of necessity, but unlike those without mental health disorders, that necessity stems from issues of being symptomatic. When a mentally ill person enters jails or prisons, they are exposed to a variety of criminogenic factors. Criminogenic risk factors are factors that directly contribute to criminal behavior. People with mental illness have higher recidivism rates than those without, and exposure to criminal behavior patterns only exacerbates the likelihood that a mentally ill person will recidivate. Mentally ill people already experience significant barriers and impairments in their lives due to their mental illness, making them less likely to commit crimes without getting caught. Both higher rates of recidivism and learned patterns of criminal behavior contribute to jails and prisons being the largest mental health treatment facilities in the world. 2. How mental health and incarceration can correlate as a result of underlying causes. One of the driving forces for the increase in the incarceration of people with mental illness was the deinstitutionalization movement that began in the mid-1950s. Although originally intended to create more humane treatment of the mentally ill, the transfer from state to local control of mental health treatment facilities led to many issues with funding. Without proper plans to continue treatment programs, correctional facilities became the main way to house people with mental illness. The shift of people from mental health treatment facilities to criminal justice settings has been called the criminalization of the mentally ill. As part of deinstitutionalization, the 1957 Short-Doyle Act and 1968 Landrum-Petris Short Act were passed in California to address the population of mentally ill people within public hospitals. The purpose of these two acts was to decrease the number of people housed in public hospitals and to increase their involvement with local programs. Although these acts were passed in hopes of allowing the mentally ill to remain in their communities, stay close to their families, and have greater freedoms, there were many negative unintended consequences associated with the policies. The shift from state to local control led to the closure of many California mental hospitals, leaving people with mental illness vulnerable to the criminal justice system. Another underlying factor in the correlation between mental health and incarceration is harsher criminal sanctions. In the 1960s, United States legislators enacted harsher criminal sanctions in hopes of addressing the causes of crime rather than simply punishing criminal behavior. The reliance on harsher punishments, including longer sentences and a greater likelihood of resentencing for convicted offenders, coincided with the negative effects of deinstitutionalization, leading to an increase in the number of incarcerated mentally ill people. With the combination of deinstitutionalization and harsher criminal sanctions, around 5% of incarcerated individuals with mental illness in the 1980s through the 2000s would have been institutionalized in state mental hospitals rather than in prisons in decades prior. Harsher criminal sanctions disproportionately harm mentally ill people. Once they have interacted with the criminal justice system, they are subjected to far harsher sentences than people without mental illness. Whether this is rooted in unconscious bias against the mentally ill or general discomfort with people who are different, the average sentence imposed on defendants suffering from mental illness is longer than the average sentence imposed on defendants who do not have a mental health diagnosis but who committed the same crime. In California, the average sentence for burglary is 30% longer for people with mental illness than for people without. Steinberg et al. Also discussed Proposition 36, a measure passed in California to ease criminal sanctions for offenders, which is denied to people with mental illness at a rate 3 times that of people with no mental illness. Even once released after serving longer sentences, people with mental illness are released with no support programs or options for mental health rehabilitation, further contributing to higher recidivism rates. This observation of Steinberg et al. Is central to showing how this cycle disproportionately continues to trap people with mental illness in the criminal justice system with few means of escaping. Both deinstitutionalization and harsher criminal sanctions are underlying causes for the correlation between mental health and incarceration. These two factors led to fewer mentally ill people receiving treatment and a greater population of mentally ill people in jails and prisons. Even once released, the lack of available treatment and support programs for mentally ill people contributes to higher rates of recidivism, continuing a harsh cycle of mentally ill people involved in the criminal justice system. Prisons are not suitable mental health services, often causing significant harm to mentally ill inmates because prisons are ill-suited environments to facilitate mental health rehabilitation. 3. How incarceration can worsen mental health. Even for people without mental illness, prisons are a high-stress environment that poses various risks to inmates' mental health. While imprisoned, inmates experience restricted movement and liberty, lack of personal privacy, and increased levels of fear and danger. Both incarcerated people with and without mental health conditions prior to their imprisonment were 3 to 5 times more likely to experience significant psychological distress than the general U.S. population. People with mental illness are significantly more sensitive to the stressors of being incarcerated, worsening their psychiatric conditions and making them more likely to be victimized by other inmates. Behavioral problems associated with psychiatric conditions often lead to harsher punishments while incarcerated, such as solitary confinement, deteriorating mental conditions even quicker. Inmates without pre-existing mental illness describe symptoms such as anxiety, rage, hallucinations, and suicidal ideation. Inmates with pre-existing mental illness experience these symptoms at even harsher rates. Shaka Signor, who spent 7.5 years in solitary confinement, said solitary confinement is one of the most inhumane and barbaric places you can find yourself. Despite significant psychological stressors, prisons have become acceptable mental health treatment facilities across the United States. However, only about a third of inmates with a mental health condition receive treatment while in prison. Incarceration not only fails to provide an environment that encourages therapeutic rehabilitation, but it also often worsens inmates' mental health, even those without pre-existing conditions. Rates of suicide inside prisons and jails are significantly higher among inmates with psychiatric disorders. The criminalization and incarceration of the mentally ill not only significantly harm them, but also the community surrounding them. Most people, unless involved in the criminal justice system, do not realize that 95% of people who are arrested and convicted, including murderers and rapists, will be released back into their communities. When there is no option for proper rehabilitation and treatment, mentally ill people will continue to be at a higher risk for incarceration and recidivism, continually exposing them to criminogenic risk factors. Many people believe that mentally ill people are involved in the criminal justice system solely because of the lack of mental health care, but researchers have shown that criminogenic risk factors are likely the main cause of crime. Morgan et al. Showed a relationship between criminalness and mental illness. Untreated mental illness results in increased psychiatric recidivism, and untreated criminalness results in increased criminal recidivism. But there also exists a relationship between untreated mental illness and increased criminal risk. Treating both mental illness and criminalness is necessary to address the complex relationship between the two. 4. Community impact and right to mental health care. However, if mental illness and criminalness are both left untreated, people will re-enter their communities without any form of rehabilitation. Often, their exposure to criminogenic behavior patterns is the primary driving force behind why they recidivate, not their mental illness. However, since their exposure to those criminogenic factors often begins with a small interaction with the criminal justice system due to a mental health condition, addressing criminalness alone is not enough to fully rehabilitate someone with mental illness. They must receive proper mental health treatment and rehabilitation before re-entering their community. Doing so will benefit both the mentally ill person and their surrounding community. Mental health care is a fundamental human right and cannot be properly maintained while in prison. If a person has been convicted of a qualifying crime, a crime other than murder, rape, or DUI, they should have the opportunity to receive mental health treatment instead of being warehoused in a jail or prison. Philosopher John Rawls argued to protect fair equality of opportunity. Stephen A. Green connects the Rawlsian belief in fair equality of opportunity to the fundamental right to mental health care. Healthcare needs are special because illness imposes a fundamental burden on individual opportunity. This extends even to mental health care because the ability to think rationally and engage in mental activities is fundamental to preserving autonomy. Psychiatric disorders may limit someone's capacity to exercise their autonomy, giving way to a moral right to mental health care. In the California criminal justice system, a large factor in determining qualification for mental health court is that a defendant's competence must be evaluated before determining if they qualify for mental health treatment. Since competence is relative, some people may argue that there must be a distinctive evaluation of individual psychiatric disorders. The rights-based claim that Green proposes extends only to psychiatric disorders that inhibit normal opportunity by diminishing rational autonomy. This observation of Green is central to the argument that mental health care is a right, especially for mentally ill people involved in the criminal justice system, since their involvement stems from their incapacity to control their behaviors.